Thank you for being here. Okay, looks like we're going to start. We have about 107 participants. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Blanca Esteves, she, her pronouns. I am in the Northwest Arkansas DSA chapter. I am also on the National Political Committee and one of the International Committee liaisons. So thank you so much for spending your Sunday evening with us. Again, I'm just going to introduce some of the folks that are here. We've got Marvin, Tom, Christian, Carrington, Luisa, Jen, Austin, and Zachariah for our staff. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'll give us a little bit of background on how this trip came about. It's a very successful trip, in my opinion. In 2019, the DSA convention really stressed upon us to make sure that we were building ties and relationships and with Latin American mass organizations. So we've been doing that in the last year of our restructure. And so for the highlight of this, we were invited by Simon Bolivar Institute to come to a few things. We went to El Congreso Bicentenario, and then we spent a few days after just visiting Venezuela. So the way that it came about, we put together a resolution. The NPC had a vote, and then the IC steering committee voted on it, finances and everything. So through this, I met a lot of really nice people. Laura Franco, everybody met her. She's so cool. So anyway, thank you so much again for being here. This was one of the best things that I've ever helped put together. Thanks so much, everyone. Marvin?
Hi, everyone. I'm going to start by talking about the sanctions to give kind of some background, some political background on the state of Venezuela. I'm just going to jump right into it. My name is Marvin, Marvin Gonzalez. I'm a member of the NYC DSA branch, and my pronouns are he, him. So from 2014 to December 2020, 98 formal unilateral coercive measures have been issued against Venezuela by the US and its allies. 75% were applied by the US, followed by the EU with 10%, and Canada with 5%. We're going to be using the term unilateral coercive measures because according to international law, really only the UN Security Council should be giving out sanctions. So unilateral coercive measures intensified dramatically during Trump's presidency with 2 acts of Congress, 7 executive orders, 64 administrative acts applying some restrictions to countries, persons, and entities that were issued by the Department of Treasury, the Department of Transportation, and the Department of Commerce. The unilateral coercive measures imposed on the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela attack the self-determination of the Venezuelan people. Both Obama and the Donald Trump administrations have used the rhetoric of defense and protection of human rights in Venezuela, anti-corruption, and anti-terrorism to justify these policies that are really aimed at undermining the political, social, and economic project of the Bolivarian Revolution. In May 2018, the former US ambassador of Venezuela, Williams Brownfield, stated that the policy of unilateral sanctions against the Venezuelan state industry were aimed at generating, quote, impact on the entire people, the ordinary citizen of the communities of Venezuela. They already suffer so much from lack of food, lack of security, lack of medicine, lack of public safety, that at this moment, perhaps the best resolution would be to accelerate the collapse, even if it produces a period of greater suffering for a period of months or perhaps years. The US government has publicly stated that the strategy of maximum pressure on Nicolas Maduro and his international allies is aimed at achieving his resignation and the installation of the so-called transitional government, which would be led by the former president of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido. The sanctions have resulted in shortages, hoarding, smuggling, smuggling of extraction, speculation, hyperinflation, and decrease in production and imports, which people need, covering from access to food, medicine, personal hygiene items, contraceptives, and a wide range of other things. A study by the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington wrote, sanctions amount to, quote, a death sentence for tens of thousands of Venezuelans, and point to 31% increase in overall mortality from 2017 to 2018, which translates into more than 40,000 deaths. So I'm just going to jump into some examples of the unilateral coercive measures. This is by no means exhaustive. I left out a bunch of stuff, but just to give a sense of what the situation is. In August 2017, the Trump administration issued Executive Order number 13808, which prohibits the government of Venezuela, including its oil company, PDVSA, from accessing US financial markets, including its debt and securities market. Venezuela has a very large gold deposits. In May 2018, Trump issued Executive Order number 13835, which prohibits transactions related to the purchase of Venezuelan debt. US officials claimed the measure was intended to prevent corrupt Venezuelan officials from being able to improperly value and sell public assets in exchange. In January 2019, the Bank of England illegally confiscated gold reserves deposited by the Venezuelan government. 14 tons of gold, estimated at $1,359,000,000 were stolen. This came in addition to measures taken in November 2018, when Trump issued Executive Order number 13850, prohibiting US citizens from trading gold exported from Venezuela. On January 28, 2019, Executive Order 13850, the Treasury Department Office of Foreign Assets Control classified PDVSA as a, they designated as a designated enterprise. As a result, all assets and interests of Petróleos de Venezuela, PDVSA, are within the jurisdiction of the United States, have been blocked, and US citizens and companies are generally prohibited from transacting with that company. The attack on their oil industry is inherently an attack on the social investment made by the state, since that industry accounts for 95% of the country's foreign income. Specifically, the oil embargo, as is sometimes referred, has made acquiring food very difficult, as 45% of food was directly imported from the US and its allies, using transactions that they made from the sale of oil. Additionally, while Venezuela has the largest reserves in the world, a large part of that oil is heavy crude oil, meaning that Venezuela needs to import gasoline or naphtha, which it has historically gotten from the US. The other option is to sell the oil unrefined at a much lower price. In April 2019, the US Treasury Department sanctioned companies and vessels involved in the transportation of Venezuelan oil to Cuba. Unilateral coercive measures consisting of economic sanctions, embargoes, and economic restrictions prevent the Venezuelan population from having permanent and free access to basic food products or the means to obtain them. According to the UN senior advisor and professor of economics, Jeffrey Sachs, the unilateral coercive sanctions against Venezuela caused a decrease in public caloric intake, an increase in morbidity and mortality, both in adults and in children, and the displacement of millions of Venezuelans who fled the country as a result of worsening economic depression and hyperinflation. They aggravated Venezuela's economic crisis and made it virtually impossible to stabilize the economy, further contributing to an increase in the death toll. All these effects disproportionately hurt the poorest and most vulnerable Venezuelans, end quote. Venezuela has CLAP, which is Local Supply and Production Committees. CLAP are food distribution committees promoted by the Venezuelan government, in which communities themselves supply and distribute priority foods through a house-to-house delivery method, with products imported by the Venezuela state and delivered at prices well below they are sold in supermarket chains. The idea arose in response to the food shortages and the country's difficult economic situations. Sanctions have sought to disrupt and criminalize the supply chain that makes this program possible, a program that benefits over 7 million people. On May 17, 2018, the Colombian government seized 400 tons of food intended for the CLAP program that were to be shipped from the port of Cartagena as a result of the sanctions. On May 4th, 2019, the US Secretary Department accused Venezuelan state officials of laundering proceeds from corruption with the purchase of food for the CLAP food aid program. They issued an alert, or rather a threat, to financial entities to deter them from taking part in these operations, citing the possible negative outcomes given the sanctions. Venezuela imports most of its medicine, which the state buys and provides free or heavily subsidized. In 2017, Citibank International Bank refused to receive the transfer of funds from the Venezuelan state directed to pay a foreign private company meant to pay for the import and shipment of more than 300 doses of insulin. In December 2020, the Venezuelan government announced that Trump administration had frozen Venezuelan funds destined for the acquisition of the Russian COVID-19 vaccine, Sputnik V. And overall, the blockade has affected the availability of vaccines for 2.6 million Venezuelan children. So those are some of the quick and dirty facts about the sanctions. There are plenty more, but I'm going to hand it over to the next panelist now.
Hi, everyone. Zachariah, could you fast forward the slides for me, please, to the overview? We're going to go through some of the, we're going to go through some of the places that we saw. My name is Jen. I use she, her pronouns. My home chapter is in Eugene, Oregon. I'm a member of the National Political Committee. We went to Venezuela for 14 days. For the first 3 days we were there, we went to the Congreso. A member of the NPC went to the Alba Summit. We also visited Chavez's tomb at the 4F, which was the former military barracks and where Chavez led the first coup attempt in 1992. We visited the Robert Serra House, honoring a martyr who was murdered by right-wing paramilitary forces in 2014, where we were given a performance by the youth orchestra. Zachariah, you can go to the next slides to the photos and then scroll through the photos. We visited multiple communes, like the 5th of March commune, Comuna Luisa Caceres de Arismendi, Comuna Guerreros de la Patria. You'll hear Austin talk more about that. We visited health clinics and hospitals, and I'll talk more about that later. We visited a youth center built from shipping containers, where we watched and participated in a dance lesson, and we had a wonderful meal. We visited Petare and went to Somos Ocho Beta, a community center working with youth, where we met with workers in a sewing workshop, a representative from a feminist collective, and observed local elections. We traveled to Barcelona and Anaco in the state of Anzoátegui and visited multiple spaces and places, including the Universidad de Oriente, a formerly abandoned public university that is being reborn thanks to the community. In Barcelona, we also visited a group that are cleaning plastic from beaches and selling it, and all the proceeds go to the Universidad de Oriente efforts. That same day, we traveled to a national park and got to experience some nature. We visited the industrial sectors, Canaima Industries, the Bolivarian Space Agency, and PDVSA. Luisa will talk more about that. We also talked to several different people while we were there. We talked to representatives of communes like Angel Prado from the Comuna El Maizal and a representative from the 5th of March commune. Like I mentioned before, an NPC member attended the Alba Summit. Christian will talk more about that. We had a meeting with the foreign minister, Jorge Reza. We also met with Carlos Ron from the Institute Simón Bolívar. We briefly met with President Maduro, and we traveled to La Guaira on the coast of Venezuela, and we met with PSUV youth. So you'll see some images from our trip. Zechariah is working through those. Up next, I'm going to pass it over to Tom, who's going to talk about the Congreso.
Oh, there we go. Hi, how we doing? Zechariah, if you could get over to the section where it says Congreso, that would be just swell. A lot of exciting, beautiful photos. There's some fish. It was a good time. Anyway, as Zechariah is reorienting, I want to talk about what to me was probably the best. By the way, my name is Tom Wojek, he, him. I am the co-chair of the Americas subcommittee within DSA International Committee. I would like to talk about the Congreso Bicentenario de los Pueblos, which we attended from June 21st through the 24th, which was to me perhaps the best representation of socialist internationalism during our time in Venezuela. The Congreso was an attempt to bring all these representative groups from all over the world together to discuss issues of capitalism, socialism, and anti-imperialism. In every conventional sense, it was a totally regular conference. It just so happened to be occurring outside of the realm of American hegemony. And we were talking about socialism and anti-imperialism from a variety of perspectives. By the way, it's worth noting that the Congreso itself, Congreso Bicentenario de los Pueblos, is in reference to the commemoration of the Battle of Carabobo, which represented a historical and ideological theme for the Congress. One of the big mantras that we heard throughout the entire Congreso was the Battle of Carabobo is today, which reflects the continuing fight to realize the dream of Simón Bolívar in the struggle for independence. For those of you who are not familiar, the Battle of Carabobo represented a superb military victory for Simón Bolívar, the liberator figure, obviously, that's very, very central to Venezuela. And what that means to say the Battle of Carabobo is today means that the fight to realize independence in Venezuela is still very much alive and well. In the days of Bolivar, the primary enemy was Spain. Today, the primary obstacle is the United States and capitalist hegemony. The conference was hosted. Oh, by the way, we have some wonderful, lovely pictures of Evo Morales, former Bolivian president, with our comrades Austin Gonzalez. This is us with the Venezuela delegation. If we could just pause the slide for just a second. But anyway, the conference itself was held in Hotel Melia, Caracas, which is where all the delegates are housed for the remainder of the conference. This was largely, as it was explained to us, for security purposes, because there were just a huge number of high-level diplomats and representatives in attendance. Obviously, people like Evo, many, many other people as well. Gathered there were not only representatives from various movements politically throughout the world, you know, Europe, Asia, South America, the Middle East, Africa, but also very robust representation from the various sectors of Venezuelan society. So split up into many groups, you had indigenous Venezuelans, Venezuelans representing the education sector, labor, gay rights, students, women's movements, health, etc. It was a wonderful collaborative event. It had a great participatory element that I'll get into in a little bit. We also heard quite a bit on the subject of Palestinian liberation. That was a huge theme throughout. We were actually addressed by leaders from the Palestinian Petrochemical Union. We had several keynote speakers, including Evo Morales, obviously. We had Adán Chávez, who is the brother of Hugo Chávez. And also our final address of the conference was delivered by Adriana Salvatierra of MAS, who, if you're not familiar, is a hero of the recent attempted coup in Bolivia. And so we were there meeting with them, strengthening our institutional connections, sharing our experiences as it pertains to our specific circumstances, which we were very much invited to share, because more than just being a conference, there was an element of the Congreso that was very, very intense. I'm sure I speak for everyone, in which we workshopped ways to develop a coherent strategy to fight for socialism and to end capitalism as it exists today. We worked in various breakout groups, which spanned the course of the Congreso, to develop coherent points of unity, which were summarized by just a bunch of breakout groups relating to like indigenous struggles, labor struggles, education struggles. We tried to break up the groups as much as humanly possible, just so we could, optimize our engagement with everything. And I think that was far and away the correct thing to do. Also, I think the thing that was most illuminating about everything is that each delegation from all around the world was given an opportunity not only to opine on, conditions of Venezuela, but also conditions of their own country, which people were speaking of in great detail. It was a really profoundly beautiful moment of togetherness with the international community. And frankly, as I said, a fantastic example of the socialist internationalism that we're trying to cultivate in our organization. There were about 1,200 people there. And as I said, the entire point was to bring together a broad coalition of socialists and anti-imperialists. There's actually a quote from the website, which was generated by just these discussions that I quite like, from an Argentine Marxist sociologist who was able to speak. And he says on the importance of international socialism that, this is a direct quote, "Without coordination, we will not have any possibility of countering the imperialist onslaught that has been launched so fiercely against the peoples who are fighting for their independence, self-determination, and true democracy." Although these movements took on a wide variety of characters, this was a coalition of not all people who completely agreed with each other or people who totally subscribed to the same, school of socialism. They still saw inherent value in assembling themselves in coalition to advance a unified project and improve the quality of life in their own country by struggling for the liberations of people many miles away. It was, I would characterize it as, like I said, and I'm sure people will also chime in, really, really moving experience far and away. Just, by the way, speaking pragmatically in terms of like developing DSA's connections, in terms of developing DSA's, relationships to all these organizations that we dreamed of talking about, this advanced the work of our organization by light years. I cannot stress this enough. This will be far and away the basis for so much work, specifically in the International Committee going forward. And also, I think very significantly, this was a wonderful introduction for the DSA, for all of these organizations, who for the first time was actually engaging with our organization on a primary basis. We were told multiple times that people had heard of the struggles that we were, engineering in the States. But this was a wonderful thing. This was a tremendous leap forward, and I am extraordinarily grateful to have participated in it in the capacity that I did. So thank you so much. That's the conclusion of my section. I'm going to be passing it off to our dear beloved comrade, Christian.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tom. I think if we can move on to the next slide. Hello, everyone. We did have quite a few Indigenous leaders present, just showing the pictures, which is, I think, super important. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Alba Summit. I was fortunate enough to get to attend the summit, which was held on the bicentennial of the Battle of Carabobo. For those who aren't familiar, ALBA, which stands for the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, if we want to go to the next slide, please, or the Alianza Bolivariana para los Pueblos de Nuestra América, is an intergovernmental organization. It was founded on the belief in the idea of la Gran Patria, which is taken from the Bolivarian ideology of Simón Bolívar, which sought to unite the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. ALBA was founded in 2004 by Venezuela and Cuba, and now includes the countries of Bolivia, Nicaragua, Dominica, Grenada, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Antigua and Barbuda. The summit was kicked off by President Maduro, who spoke of the importance of the Battle of Carabobo and significance of the meeting on a day honoring the legacy of Simón Bolívar. We heard remarks from various heads of state and government, including the president of Nicaragua, the prime ministers of Dominica, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Antigua and Barbuda, and Grenada. Each member spoke of the impact of COVID on the country and reiterated that they would not have been able to survive the pandemic alone. Grenada, for example, cited that they have no active cases, and they credited the help of Bolivia and Cuba for sending them tests and doctors, and how the Alba Bank came forward for help with purchasing vaccines. Antigua and Barbuda expressed similar sentiments. St. Vincent relayed how during a volcanic eruption, where 20% of the population had to be evacuated, Cuba came to their aid and not one person died. The Nicaraguan president declared the US as the biggest interventionists of the world. But I would say my favorite speaker would be the Prime Minister, Roosevelt Skerrit of Dominica, who expressed gratitude for Chavez and Castro for creating solidarity between Latin America and the Caribbean. He spoke of solidarity with the people of Venezuela, regardless of who is president, and that they must not lose sight of the machinations of those who do not want them united. There was also, at the end, a very firm declaration of the need to end the blockade against Cuba and Venezuela. I'd say the importance of the event was not just in the gathering of so many people with power, but of what the implications are for those of us who live in the middle of US empire and want to be in solidarity with the people of those countries. The plurinationalism that was reiterated throughout the summit under the umbrella of a common project, El Proyecto Común, is seen as the path to liberation. And that is significant for us as socialists who understand that our project cannot be limited to our borders, that our project must be international. And materially, the implications of a pandemic. There was big congratulations to Cuba for the recent news of the efficacy of their COVID vaccine and what that would mean not only for the Cuban people, but for those in Venezuela who lack access due to ongoing US sanctions. Despite the difficulties generated by the unilateral coercive measures that Marvin was talking about imposed by the US on Venezuela and Cuba, there is a strong sentiment that joint work towards la Gran Patria will overcome the failure of the neoliberal model, particularly in the face of the ongoing pandemic. And it's something we will need to contend with, not only for future pandemics, but for other global crises like the climate crisis. I think, Zachariah, if you can move on to the next slide, I think that's the last one on this one. It's just me standing in front of the Alba Summit. It was pouring rain, but it was very interesting and a really nice surprise. It was not something that was necessarily planned during our trip, and it was great to be able to come back and speak to the rest of the delegation about all of that, while also getting to know some of our international delegates, fellow international delegates that were there, including some of the folks that you saw, obviously Evo Morales and Jaime Vargas of Ecuador, and I also got to speak to some people from my parents' homeland, which is Mexico. So that is it for me, and we are going to move on to the next section. The lovely Austin will be talking to us about communes.
Cool, thank you so much there for the beautiful introduction, Christian. This has been such an amazing call so far, such beautiful people talking to us about such beautiful things. Also, thank you, Blanca, for facilitating. Thank you to all my fellow panelists here for giving us your time. And of course, thank you, viewers, for giving us your evening. My name is Austin Gonzalez. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a Virginia-based organizer of Puerto Rican descent, as well as a member of the Richmond, Virginia chapter of DSA. I'm also a member of the National Political Committee, as well as one of its liaisons to the International Committee, and was extremely honored. Honored really isn't even the word, to have been a part of this delegation. And I'll be talking to you all a little bit about the communes that we were able to engage with, a little bit about what their project is like, and some of the takeaways we got from being able to see these people struggling on the ground to build their view of socialism, right? So both weeks, but particularly I would say during week 2, we met with many communes. It was honestly hard to even keep count of the amount of communes and Venezuelan working people that we were able to meet with. What is crucial to understand first and foremost is just what exactly are these communes, right, within the Venezuelan context. What does the saying they use, comuna o nada, what does that even mean, right? Well, any Venezuelan we spoke with was very clear in acknowledging that Venezuela is a capitalist society, right? But it is one that is transitioning to a socialist one, or at least trying to, right? That's what they're trying to do. During the Hugo Chavez era, most of the struggles that occurred revolved around that fact. Events such as the 2002 coup d'etat against Chavez from the business sector, the oil lockouts that happened thereafter, the opposition recall, various attempts at internal sabotage during Chavez's presidency. It was not until Chavez was in his final years that the expansion of this project, the Commune project, which really are the building blocks of socialism in Venezuela, really began to take place. It was in Chavez's famous final speech, known as El Golpe de Timon, or in English, the Strike at the Helm speech, that it was made clear that the Commune project, that is to say, the self-management of the Venezuelan working class and their utility to truly own the means of their own production, was key to the building of socialism in Venezuela. Chavez would famously proclaim, as I said earlier, comuna o nada, commune or nothing. That is to say that the Bolivarian revolution is nothing without the commune, that without worker self-management and the ability of workers to own the means of their production, the revolution was stagnating. As Chavez died not long thereafter from that speech, it became these communes, I should say, became a critical component within the Venezuelan socialist movement to build upon these projects and expand them. It's been during the last 10 years that these communes have begun to experience significant growth and have played a critical role in combating US sanction, blockade, the unilateral coercive measures that Marvin was talking about, which has been devastating, right? And as I will discuss from what we saw, these communes are a critical cog in the goal of self-sufficiency within Venezuela. So an overview of the communes that we actually got to see, right? The people we got to meet. The background that I laid, I also want to spend some time, of course, touching upon what that really means practically. As I mentioned earlier, we met with a few comuneros and communes during week 1, but it would primarily be week 2 where we traveled to different parts of the country that we were able to truly see these communes in action and to really get a sense of their possibilities as well as their logistical limitations in the face of such crippling coercive measures. One commune that I would have loved to visit is El Maizal, which we talked, Jen touched upon a little bit earlier in reference to Angel Prado. I won't spend too much time on El Maizal as we were unable to visit them once again, but that brief presentation from Angel Prado is extremely important and was very instructive, right? Angel is a key organizer in El Maizal, as well as somebody who has come into visible conflict with local government officials in the past. Angel describes some of the details of El Maizal, right? How it is a large rural commune in the state of Portuguesa. What El Maizal is most famous for is the production of corn, hence the name El Maizal, right? Corn is a key component of the Venezuelan diet, like many Latin American countries, right? So therefore, local production of corn has become very important as food has become scarce in the past 5 to 6 years. Angel Prado himself is just an incredibly inspiring figure, an incredibly inspiring person. And once again, we would have liked to actually be able to, travel to Portuguesa to see El Maizal in person. But El Maizal is still a great example of what these communes are, right? In the case of El Maizal, a massive space of land that is worked on in common with people who vote on everything they do as far as the production and distribution process of the corn. Any money they make from the corn is held in common, right? El Maizal is considered one of the most successful examples of a commune. After we met with Angel, right, it was the following day that we were able to really take our first trip to see one of these communes in person, specifically the Campamento de Pioneros, right, or the pioneers, who are a component of the Movimiento de Pobladores y Pobladoras, or in English, the settlers movement. These settlers are essentially squatters that occupy unused land and build houses there, right? They literally go to plots of land that are owned by rich people that are totally unused and just take it back for the people. We were able to visit the pioneros in Caracas, and there were so many takeaways from this meeting, right? Once again, the unused land that they take, and in particular in this specific one that we visited, this is in wealthier parts of Caracas as well. So as you might imagine, some of their neighbors do not like that very much, some of their wealthy neighbors, right? This is where the very interesting dance that these self-managed communes do with their local government bureaucrats, right? In some ways, the contradictions between the communes and the bureaucracy can manifest itself in nasty ways. In this case in particular, the government has allowed for a permit process for these squatters to be able to take over this unused land and gain protection from their more hostile neighbors. And once again, it was astonishing. Words can't do justice to the bravery of these people. Seeing their story was so inspiring. They even had some of their younger comuneros do testimonies and dances. It was a humbling sight, to say the very least. As far as urban communes, once again in Caracas, we also had the privilege of visiting El Panal commune in the famous 23 de Enero barrio, as well as El Otro Beta commune in the famous Petare barrio. My visit to 23 de Enero was without the other members of the delegation. Then the rest of the delegation's visit with El Otro Beta was without me. So I will speak to my experience once again with El Panal commune and Alexis Vive collective, which once again were in 23 de Enero, which this barrio itself is an incredibly fascinating place, right? The graffiti that I saw here was without a doubt the most radical in nature. This is a community known for its combative participation in the protest movements against some of Venezuela's right-wing authoritarian leaders of the latter 20th century. They're deeply influenced by the ideological discipline of the local collective, Alexis Vive, as I mentioned earlier. The fusion of these grassroots forces with the blossoming of the commune project has forged a unique experience of community organization and a necessary example of a complex and integral system of a true communal economy, right? What the hell do all those words even mean? This truly is a self-governing community. Los Panalitos, as they are known, which means honeycombs in Spanish, which is kind of cool, I think. They have a communal bank. They have a popular assembly that governs the commune, which is essentially the barrio, right? Once again, this is a fully self-governing barrio that has essentially begun to replace the role of the state, so to speak, entirely within its territory. And once again, these urban communes were amazing. I could go on and on, but I do want to touch upon the rural communes here as well, and try not to take up like an entire hour, because I could definitely talk about this for multiple hours. During week 2, we were able to travel to the state of Anzoátegui, right, which is about 6 hours east of Caracas. We visited the municipalities, as Jen mentioned earlier, of Barcelona, Puerto La Cruz, the rural municipality of Anaco. During our time in Anzoátegui, we were able to meet many amazing communes and comuneros, right? Once again, it's impossible to list all of them here. In particular, I do want to highlight a few of these rural communes. Comuna Luisa Cáceres, which once again we have referenced a little bit earlier, was a remarkable place. It was the first commune we visited, which me personally had never even heard of before, unlike the more famous ones I've referenced earlier, right? Like the Pioneros or El Maizal. What this commune in particular, Luisa Cáceres, specializes in is recycling waste, right? Because the state, or I should say in part because the state has become so crippled and ineffective due to a lot of the unilateral coercive measures of the last 5 years, right? These rural communities in many places have had to subsume as many roles of the state as they are able to, right? In Luisa Cáceres, they described to us how they recycle waste through machinery that they themselves had built, right? They even showed us a mini corn processing facility that they had makeshift built from materials that were available to them. Truly amazing things. Just an amazing example of the will of these people to not only survive, but to persist in pursuing their socialist project and their desire to build a community that is once again for the many and not the few. And finally here, one last commune that I'd like to touch upon is another commune in the countryside of Anzoátegui, Comuna Gran Mariscal de Ayacucho, right? At this commune, we once again saw the power of the people, and in particular, the power of women in these commune projects. Nearly every commune we went to in these rural communities was led by strong brown women, nearly all of them. Comuna Gran Mariscal de Ayacucho in particular was centered around women and women's health. Now, I won't dive too deep into the aspects of what that was like here, as Jen will be doing so very shortly. But as far as the commune itself, it had a women's communal center. They had physical therapy for pregnant women there. They had a bakery as well as textiles to make their own clothes for themselves. They truly did everything at that commune. And in summary here, what I think are big takeaways from all of this, once again, I could talk hours about literally each one of these communes. Once again, before I was able to visit Venezuela, my own personal conception of the communes was mostly around those most famous ones, right? El Maizal, where they grow corn, or Los Pioneros, where they squat on unused land. What I truly came to learn and could not have fully grasped without being there in person is that these communes, they do everything. They do everything. The last commune I just mentioned, Gran Mariscal de Ayacucho, once again, they had medical clinics. They make their own clothes for themselves. They make their own food for themselves. They are truly assuming the roles of the state in many of these communities. And it was just simply remarkable to truly see, like with our own eyes, the withering away of the state, so to speak, before our eyes, right? But once again, due to the economic war and blockade, the state is simply unable to provide for a lot of these communities. These communities have now taken the role of the state upon themselves in a fundamentally democratic fashion, with wholly democratic decision-making through the commune and through their popular assemblies. But once again, I will stop there. I've already gone over on my time, I think. So I will pass it back on over to Jen here.
Hello again. Zachariah, if you could forward through to the health clinics. Wonderful. We visited health clinics and women's centers while we were in Venezuela. First, I want to talk a little bit about the COVID response from Venezuela. It was really remarkable. They instituted what they call a 7-by-7 system, so that every other week is what they call radical quarantine. No stores are open, the beaches are closed, everyone has to stay home. Alternating weeks, they do this. The first month of the quarantine was entirely a radical quarantine. COVID PCR tests are free. We took 4 COVID tests in total, one before we left, one upon our arrival in Venezuela. We took a rapid test during the conference. And in order to leave Venezuela, you have to take another COVID test. Neighborhood clinics, they went into the community house by house, disinfecting during COVID. Many buildings that we went to had temperature checks and disinfecting before entering. They had like a sprayer and you had to walk through the spray. Or one notable place we went to had an inflatable room that you had to enter and walk through before you could enter, and it sprayed disinfectant on you. We visited the 5th of March commune. That is an example of the Into the Neighborhood program, which was a dream of Chavez and Castro. They build modular buildings that are built by the community. And this is for not just the 5th of March commune, but for all areas, all neighborhoods. So they build these modular units, and then they bring in a Cuban doctor for 2 to 3 years to help them get set up. There are thousands of these modules working in poor neighborhoods across Venezuela. On the ground floor of these buildings, there's a clinic. On the 2nd floor, the doctor actually lives there. The doctor works the first half of the day in the clinic until about noon. And then they spend the second half of the day in the streets doing home visits, visiting with people in the neighborhood. They have suffered under the unilateral coercive measures. Acquiring medication and supplies is very, very difficult. Many doctors are leaving the country. It's been extraordinarily difficult for them to survive and be able to help people. We visited some women's centers where multiple communes that we visited have women's clinics. There are clinic rooms for a primary care doctor that are available about 3 times a week. There's an OB/GYN room with a gynecologist who's available 2 times a week. There's an education space. They have what's called a humanized birth plan, which is a holistic approach from the beginning of pregnancy through birth to improve the health of the baby and the mother, and to be prepared when arriving at the hospital. They have education, physical therapy and exercises, prenatal medical care, and more. Effects of the unilateral coercive measures here are, similar to the health clinics. Medication and supplies are very, very hard to come by. Diapers are not readily available. They've begun to manufacture their own on a small scale. One of the communes that we visited had a sewing workshop where they make diapers. But even getting fabric is hard to come by because of the unilateral coercive measures. So they have a difficult time making any diapers, making clothing, period, really. In the first years of the revolution, 100% of people had access to contraception, but today it's a different story. So it's difficult to access contraception. We also visited a hospital, Min Mujer, which is a women's and baby hospital, where they're suffering under the blockade, not being able to get medication and supplies, like other health clinics. We met with their security director and the director of the hospital, who told us about the effects. Really, really heartbreaking, and an example of what the US empire is doing to the people of Venezuela. I want to pass it over to Luisa, who's going to talk to us about the industrial sector.
Hey, thanks. Jen, we can go ahead and go to the slides. I'll be talking about 3 places that we went to: Canaima, Factory of Factories, Fábrica de Fábricas, and our meeting with PDVSA. So about me briefly, my name is Luisa Martinez. I was born in Chile, I use she, her pronouns. A real honor for me, honestly, to be part of this delegation. I'm on the steering committee of the IC, liaison to the Americas, co-chair of Portland, Oregon DSA, and a couple years ago, I helped found Hands On Venezuela Portland. So it was a real kind of dream come true for me as a socialist. So first, for Canaima, if we want to go to the next slide, this was part of the Venezuelan Socialist Revolutionary Project to provide free education for all Venezuelan youth. And so Canaima is the plant where computers are assembled. Right now, they are, as a result of illegal sanctions, they're at about 10% capacity. A lot to do with their inability to get materials. But prior to illegal sanctions, they produced 11 million laptops and tablets for Venezuelan students and educators as well. And this is for a population of less than 30 million people. So that's actually an extraordinary feat. So what's happened as a result of illegal sanctions is that there's been a generational gap. So while we were walking around Venezuela, we saw it was like 1 out of every 20 people had this tricolor backpack. And so what it was the backpack that these computers or tablets came in along with like books and pencils and stuff like that. And so that program had to be, for the most part, halted as a result of, again, the illegal sanctions. So there's been a generational gap. So you have like young Venezuelans maybe seeing their older siblings having gotten these opportunities, whereas they did not. Another thing briefly, if you want to go to the next couple slides, is that this was all open source. And that was really made clear to us that everything is publicly accessible and available, and that it's tied to this idea of education being a very basic human right. And so also one thing that's notable is that they've pivoted to repairing neonatal incubators. Like Jen touched on, there has been a tremendous impact on the health system there. And one way of kind of combating the effects of illegal sanctions, the impact that it's had on infant mortality is to, again, shift the focus of its institution to repairing neonatal incubators. Next, we visited the Factory of Factories, Fábrica de Fábricas. Again, this was a concept under Chavez. It was partially finished in 2019, if you want to go a couple slides, to produce large-scale machinery so that Venezuelans can continue the industrial development process. We were guided by a gentleman named Leonel Rodriguez. He's a mechanical engineer. And so to give you some idea, again, of the impacts of illegal sanctions, it was built for 7,400 workers, and they currently have about 125. And that's kind of it's the critical support for Leonel. He was very, very sweet to us. And so that's a combination of obviously the illegal sanctions, but also COVID. So one of the big issues is that they have raw materials are very difficult to come by. Another thing worth mentioning, at least for me personally, if you want to go maybe one slide, there we go, was the relationship to China. So I thought because of, again, the emergence of a multipolar world, that there would be more of a relationship to China. And that was clear. I mean, we saw the machinery, it was clearly written in Chinese, but what we learned was that whilst there are so many things that are manufactured in China, the United States still holds many of those patents. So there's a clear kind of commercial connection, right? But again, the illegal sanctions meant that, you know, maybe China sold these parts to the Venezuelan state, but then they kind of just upped and left. So the quote we got was they left the machinery without the keys and that they did not leave manuals. So for instance, we saw 2 giant generators that they hoped to be to run within 6 months. They just kind of were at a loss in terms of how to control them. And so, you know, Fábrica, they repaired and recycled old train wheels, again, kind of the limitations of the situation that they've been put in. But it was built for stuff like manufacturing irrigation pumps and centrifugal pumps, those types of things. And then lastly, I'll touch on our visit with PDVSA. If you want to go to the next slide. So just briefly, there's Leonel in the yellow shirt, if you want to go one more. So PDVSA, for those of you who don't know, it's a state-owned oil company. So many of the social projects are funded through oil revenues. For those of you who don't know, in the 2000 coup, which lasted about 2 days, corrupted PDVSA workers actually played a big role in that. So as a result, now political education is required for all workers there. If you want to go to the next slide, I'll show some of the books. One thing, that's perfect. One thing that I think we all took away from that meeting was really the tone of the meeting. So, you know, we had visited Fábrica de Fábricas earlier on. And so we thought like, oh, we're going to get some hard hats and just walk around. They'll show us rigs or whatever, I don't know. I think that was the expectation. And instead, what we got was, it was a meeting, but it was about 6 or 7 people all saying the same thing, 6 or 7 Venezuelans of varying kind of status within the company saying the same exact thing, which was the United States will get our oil from our cold dead hands. And that was really impactful as a message, because irrespective of the way that you feel, the way that we feel about energy extraction or mineral-based economies, there are 2 reasons why the United States is constantly attacking Venezuela. So the first thing is ideological, right? Our US, our DC cannot stand the idea of another Cuba, another Nicaragua in the global South, right? So that's the first thing. And then second is material, right? And at the end of the day, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves on the planet. And so the message was made clear to us that the Venezuelan oil is for the Venezuelans. So that's the end of my talk. Next up, I'm sorry, who's the next up? Oh, Carrington for our meeting with the Sub Youth. Carrington, you're on mute.
Hi, everybody. I'm Carrington Morris, she, her from New York City DSA. I serve on the International Committee's Steering Committee, and I also do political education with North Brooklyn DSA. And for my report back, I'm going to talk about Coercive youth. So one of our last days in Venezuela, we spent the day with the youth section of United Socialist Party of Venezuela, or Coercive Juventud, in the coastal town of La Guaira. Coercive is the largest and the ruling political party in Venezuela, for those who aren't familiar. The half dozen members we met with elaborated on the structure and focus of their group. While most who we met with appear to be in their early 20s, they explained to us that those under 35 are considered youth. And while voting age is 18, those 15 and older are invited and encouraged to submit projects, which Coercive takes special interest in supporting financially and otherwise. As Coercive is a socialist project, much of the work revolves around social services and political education. And importantly, Coercive Juventud is very much embedded in the community and plays a major role in the city. This role was most dramatically evident in May 2020, when their hometown of La Guaira was subject to an attempted military invasion, with helicopters hovering above the city at 2 or 3 in the morning. The Coercive Juventud alerted the Venezuelan military, and in doing so were able to help stave off an invasion, for which they were duly recognized by the state for their good work. But dramatic examples aside, the youth group's more typical day-to-day activity includes serving their neighbors. We learned that there are 3,427 streets in La Guaira, and each one of them has an active representative from Coercive Juventud. These representatives provide food services and are on hand for emergency services. Much of their focus is on community engagement efforts, which include culture, sports, and politics. Additionally, they help facilitate local elections, which have full community participation. To maintain such a concentrated grassroots presence, recruitment plays a big role for the group. In terms of recruitment strategies, Coercive youth say their party line is to adapt to ground conditions and build from there. They see youth outreach as quite different from outreach to the rest of the population, and see part of their mission as increasing consciousness and awareness around the cause of suffering of the Venezuelan people. As a party, they say they're quite clear about their enemy being capitalism, imperialism, and neocolonialism. An emphasis of their work is including women among their leadership and making it clear that women play a fundamental role in revolution. And indeed, among the youth representatives, females present included the finance minister and a Coercive youth advocate for women's health. This emphasis they consider separate from women's rights, which they are also champions of. Participation in Coercive Juventud is an opportunity for women to acquire professional experience as well as education. Another emphasis for the youth group is political education. They have a national school called Escuela Sucre, named for a great military strategist under Simón Bolívar, which offers online workshops, seminars, and courses. These political education offerings are open to the public, and some are considered mandatory for certain leadership roles within Coercive Juventud. Finally, the group engages the community in political campaigns, most recently taking to the streets in protest of Israeli crimes against Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah and elsewhere. They've also rallied recently against the Colombian military. As a group and among other positions they hold, the Youth Party embraces self-determination and opposes intervention from foreign governments. The meeting between Coercive Youth and the DSA delegation was an exchange of introductions to our respective organizations. We concluded our discussion letting them know our organization has much to learn from theirs, and we agreed to keep in contact in order to do so. And with that, I am going to pass it back to Blanca.
Thanks, Carrington. Thanks so much to everyone that presented. What an amazing report back. I know that our chat is very lively here. I would like to say that, yes, the Venezuelan people all ask us to end the blockade. We have some announcement. We have a draft local chapter resolution here that I'm going to drop in the chat for everyone here. And we also have the link to congressional cheat sheet. So this will include Senate Foreign Relations Committee, along with corresponding DSA chapters, House Foreign Affairs Committee. You can look into that as well. So now we're going to, hold on just a minute. Now we're going to go into question and answers with our committee. Just a minute. Okay, so here are some of the questions that we've been asked, and I'll just ask them, and then we will have I'm so sorry, I skipped us. We need to have some reflections first, and then we'll do Q&A. I'm so sorry, we'll kick it off with Marvin.
The biggest thing that I think I'm took away with was really like the central role that political education plays for not just like in any part of the Bolivarian Revolution, but pretty much in every part of the Bolivarian Revolution, right? You know, you hear people talk about political education in the communes. You hear people talk about political education in the Juventud movement. You hear people talk about political education in PDVSA. So Venezuela has like given out more books than like any country in Latin America, and I think that is something that I think I'd like us to take away with, just how central political education is to really building a base for ourselves.
Thanks, Marvin. I think my biggest takeaway was how participatory the communes are. They have communal councils. They have, you know, democracy from the bottom up. Everyone is expected to participate. They call it participatory protagonist democracy. Really taking a hand in your everyday life, making decisions together, building trust and consensus with each other. That was my biggest takeaway.
My constant eye, and by the way, everyone has so eloquently described what they found interesting and engaging about our time in Venezuela. My constant eye was actually trained at our own organization as we begin to sort of tiptoe upon the world stage. Our movement is growing. We are kind of drifting out of the theoretical and finally, after so much time, asking questions about how do we engage with the world as it actually exists. And for all the reasons that we've discussed, for all the reasons that, you know, are important for the Peru delegation, for the Venezuela delegation, I think that Venezuela was a fantastic growing up moment for DSA. It forces us to answer questions like, what does it mean to engage with a movement? What does it mean to build a revolution, right? What does it mean to defend a revolution? And I just want to conclude with saying very briefly, for a million reasons why this program was a complete success, million reasons why we were so very honored and grateful to participate in this program. And I truly do believe that coming out of Venezuela, it is more evident to me than ever that the path forward is solidarity, that the path forward is unity and socialism and internationalism.
Thanks, Tom. That's wonderful. Before I do my reflection, I just want to say really fast too, just like I really appreciate the passion of everyone in the chat, but also like so many of us just got back. You know, we were there for a while. Some of us have not had time to process everything that went on, to talk to each other as a delegation. So just asking for a little patience and grace for your comrades who are, you know, making the best of this moment. And I think at the end of the day is we went to Venezuela, it happened. And now we are working very hard to learn what the implications of that trip is, especially as political organizers in this organization and what that means for future work. So again, just wanted to reiterate that. I think one of the main reflections that I took away from my visit there was the need to build community in the work that we do. The spirit of collaboration and a joint project was apparent in every place that we went, and in every group that we spoke to. And I know that, and I felt like I could see that too, just because it was really great to be able to speak to people in Venezuela in their native language, which was, I think added a different dynamic, at least to my experience. And, I think it's also the implications of that are like, how do we build this in a country like the United States that's rooted in individualism and competition, and overcome the idea that needing each other to survive is not a bad thing, but an absolute necessity, particularly in the face of a global pandemic and all of the future work that we have to do as socialists living in the heart of empire.
Cool. Yeah, I think it's me now. I'll be super duper brief here. So, wow, this has already been so extremely good, right? Once again, thanks everybody, and we're still going to do Q&A, and I'll pass it over to everybody here in a moment. But I was in both delegations to Peru as well as this delegation here to Venezuela, and my time in Venezuela gave me very practical, tangible lessons as a socialist. I think the first lesson I learned is that I thoroughly enjoy doing things that scare the chair of the Republican Party, as well as doing things that ruin Elliot Abrams's day. I think that's extremely cool for our organization, personally. My serious final thought here before I pass it away is that socialism in Venezuela is a very vulnerable project. It isn't perfect. It is very difficult. It isn't linear. And every single person we engage with in Venezuela recognized that. They all discussed the situation of Venezuela with nuance. They recognized the mistakes the government has made. They also recognized the critical places where the government has had support for them. But fundamentally, those people that we met in the communes, these average working Venezuelans, they're building something special. They believed it, right? And we could feel it in every single commune we visited. Socialism is unique in every place that it takes place. Support and engagement with the working class is so critically important to be able to learn from these projects, to learn from both their successes and their failures. And it is important to do just that, learn from these projects. So I'll pass it over to, I think, Luisa's next.
Hey, thanks, Austin. Personal reflection of mine is that DSA, as a result of this trip, or my experience with this trip, is actually closer to the left coalition that has been elected by Venezuelans than I ever considered. The coalition represents a broad spectrum of the left, of leftist thought, and just like here, there's people that we disagree with as individuals within DSA, right? The same is true for mass parties underneath that coalition, like the PSUV. And then another thing that I kind of reflection of mine is that the role of the left is different in the United States in comparison to Venezuela, where the left is one, right? So here being ultra critical feels like it fits like a comfortable shoe, right? But the impression that I got was that socialist revolutionary political understanding is that you're part of a larger movement and that you work within that movement. And so you're always self-critical, you're always self-evaluating, but that we never lose sight of the bigger picture. And while we don't know what it's like to win, unfortunately, as DSA members, we do know the joys and the pains of that obligation to one another when we're working towards a larger goal. So that was kind of my reflection. Next is Carrington.
Hey, all, and I don't think I said it before, but it really was an honor to be part of this historic delegation to Venezuela. So the biggest takeaway from this trip by far for me was just how very much the Venezuelan people want an end to the US's illegal blockade. In all the projects we saw, the many communes, work, social, and political projects, everyone we met implored us to please do what we could to have the sanctions lifted. The spirit of the Bolivarian Revolution runs strong through all the projects we visited and the people we met. It's a spirit that will only have a chance to soar once freed from the boot of empire. That's it for me, and I hand it back to Blanca.
Thanks, Carrington. Okay, so we have made it to the question and answer section of our report back. Wonderful. So here's our first question. I am interested in whether you tried to meet with any feminists who are struggling for abortion rights in Venezuela, where abortion is prohibited, in representatives of indigenous communities who are struggling for land, in families and supporters of political prisoners, such as union activists who are struggling for free union rights and higher wages. Do we have, Luisa, would you like to take this question?
Yeah, sure. So one of our attachés, Laura Franco, is a very well-known feminist in Venezuela. And so I asked her this question, or really about the status about the struggle for abortion in Venezuela. And so it was a long conversation, probably about 45 minutes. But so the impression, so the idea was that, you know, the Catholic Church still plays a large role in Venezuelan society. It's still very conservative that way. So that is not anything that you can shake off. I think comparatively, you know, Cuba has abortions free and on demand, right? But they also at some point kicked out the Pope. So it's a little bit different. Right now, for instance, some comparison, Venezuela, because of the sanctions, illegal sanctions, and just because of also the global pandemic, you know, they need something like the Pope to say, to pressure US power to say, hey, maybe you should let him buy some vaccines. You know, you need that kind of voice right now, because at least the impression that I got is that, again, it's a fragile democracy and they're doing the best they can with the circumstances that they're under. And so things have gotten a little bit better now, but, you know, between 2016 and 2018, things were very shaky. Also, another thing to consider is the role that legal sanctions have played on the availability for contraception, right? So contraception was free, it was abundant prior to illegal sanctions. And now, you know, the scarcity has increased the costs, and then the cost has then become prohibited for working class Venezuelan women, right? So there have been some rollbacks that have kind of taken some of the sight away from the struggle for abortion, right? So for instance, the fact that contraception costs $10 for a pack, that's like kind of an impossible amount of money for $10 US. So that's kind of an impossible amount of money for a Venezuelan woman to pay. Somebody that I spoke to, I was there for a couple extra days. You know, he said he lives off $10 a month. So to give you some idea. Also, and again, I'm trying to make this brief, it's not as if this is not something that people have been working towards. So there's 3 ways of going about gaining abortion rights for women. So first is a political strategy where you claim that it's already, I mean, arguably it is legal, right? If you look at, I think it's organic law 67 or 76, I'm dyslexic, one of those two, it states in broad terms that a right to control how many women you have is an organic law, right? So one method is by simply arguing that it's already legal and that we're just going to incorporate abortion rights into a health system that already exists, right? We're just going to systematize it. The second thing is to pass a law that, you know, makes abortion legal outright, right? And so reform the criminal code. And then the third thing was the referendum, like what happened in Argentina, right? So one thing to remember, like Venezuela, when it comes to abortion, is not outside the realm of the way that abortion is treated as an issue in Latin America, right? And so that's a result of obviously generations upon generations of European and U.S. colonialism. So the third route is for the referendum, like Argentina passed, but that was also a 30-year campaign. Right. So these are just some things to take into consideration. It's not as if nobody thinks about these things. There's been a resurgence. So recently on March 8th, there was like a state or a countrywide teletown hall where feminists all over Venezuela came together and had a debate about the next steps, not about abortion, but just kind of the road moving forward. So I hope that answers that question.
Thanks, Luisa. Another question we have is, I've heard great things about the CLAP program. Is it exclusively food oriented? What can we learn for our mutual aid programs here? We love mutual aid.
I'll take that. The CLAP boxes are not just food. Of course, they have a lot of food in them, mostly staple foods, but not just food. We went to a when we visited Petare, we went to Somos Ocho Beta, which had a sewing workshop to teach women and girls how to sew. They have made over 1 million uniforms for children, which are included in the CLAP boxes. So children get access to clothes. They get their uniform in their CLAP boxes. For mutual aid, I mean, there are many examples of mutual aid. Really, this sense of community in the communes working together. The recycling area that we visited in Barcelona, where they have an area on a river where the river meets the Caribbean Sea. And then they take boats to an area on the coast on that river and clean up plastic. And they gather tons and tons of trash bags. We spent the morning gathering trash with them. They sell that trash. They get $150 per ton for their plastic, which they give all of that to the Universidad de Oriente that I mentioned at the very beginning. Universidad de Oriente was an abandoned public university, which has been overtaken, and they have an effort to restart the university. The community is banding together. They're providing aid to each other. So different groups will come and do work on the university. Of course, the recycling center that I mentioned, they do a lot of cleanup efforts at the university. Communes help, they help one another within the commune all the time. When we met with Coercive, they talked about their streets program, which Carrington mentioned. They also distribute the CLAP boxes as part of a kind of a mutual aid effort there, making sure that people are taken care of. So, you know, I could go on for hours on mutual aid. I think, you know, we can learn from that, especially, you know, meeting with Coercive, the way that they, you know, take kind of a holistic approach. It's not just electing, but it's really taking care of their community.
Thank you, Jen. The next question is, we all know Venezuela and other socialist nations are heavy propagandized. What are some of the biggest instances where the falsified capitalist media version of Venezuela did not match the actual reality? Christian, you want to take it away?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think maybe the most obvious being that there's full-blown socialism, and it's the reason why Venezuela is the way that it is. I think, I mean, I would say maybe more on a small scale, the thing that I heard, you know, that saw both on the US media, and I think there were concerns even from folks who, you know, like my parents and stuff, was just like the safety concerns, which, like, sorry, as a woman, I'm always thinking about my safety concerns everywhere, does not exclude international travel. But I feel like at any point, I did not feel unsafe in the country. I took all the regular precautions that I would anywhere that I'm out and about at. But, you know, I found it was actually really refreshing to be able to, like, you know, talk to whoever I wanted to talk to go out, explore downtown Caracas. We did have attachés, which was helpful because not all of us speak Spanish, and it was helpful to get background on history. And also, obviously, we had a really jam-packed schedule that we needed to be, you know, constantly moving around for. And so that's not to say that there weren't things that we saw that were clearly like, okay, hey, yeah, we really want to make this point, and we want to set this point across. But I think when folks realize, like, oh, you're from the United States, like the one thing that they wanted to talk about more than anything was sanctions, and you know, like the coercive measures, and like our role in the US as socialists and what it meant for us to be fighting in our country for socialism, which to me is like the biggest takeaway through everything, through all of like the flair, through all of the events. That was the main takeaway for me. And I think at the end of the day, it is the most important. And I think Marvin also wanted to weigh in a little bit on that.
Yeah, I think for me, this was something that I learned specifically during the Congress, just interacting with members from different parties and from PSUV, was how often the US government talks about, and kind of like the Western journal talks about how illegitimate the voting process is here in Venezuela. I think one thing that I found very fascinating was how the opposition, all like 5 groups from the opposition, including the major ones like Democracia Acción, have gone on the record to say that they believe that the elections were conducted fair and transparently, and that the reason for their kind of the opposition's reasons for not doing so well was just because they're too dispersed. They haven't cohered around a certain kind of line or a certain kind of person. Even there is like basically not even any support for like for Guaido amongst the opposition. They all think that he should stop this thing. Like one thing that Austin, me and Austin talked about was like how you'll see like graffiti for like Leopoldo Lopez. Like there is like this opposition, but like you don't see anything about Guaido there. It's just it's not a real thing there. Like even the opposition thinks it's a joke. So I thought that was something that I was very kind of funny about, and terrible about, how like the US just distorts all these narratives.
Thanks, Marvin. Luisa in the chat has said, one thing also worth mentioning is they did not see a single unhoused person on their trip there. And it looks like we have maybe 1 minute if Tom wants to add to this, and then I will wrap us up.
Yeah, I just talking about like all the ways that like United States propaganda has completely polluted the conversation about Venezuela. We are told this myth that it is like this totalitarian monoculture, that it is like a totally socialist, every single person totally socialist. An interesting anecdote is when we were driving to the airport, from the airport to Caracas, I kind of was coming in with like, conceptions about my experience in Cuba. I thought it was going to be very different experiences. And we saw 2 billboards. One was for Jesus Christ, and the other is for Bitcoin. So, that's probably flies straight into the face of what a lot of Americans would like you to believe about Venezuela, because the truth is that it is a socialist government with a strong socialist grassroots support, which is totally at war with the private sector. And that is what causes instability, that and combined with the US sanctions. So it was tremendously illuminating to see the reality of the country, and seeing that it is a beautiful, multifaceted gem of a place. So yeah, I and frankly, that's something I wish more Americans would engage with.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, so I have one reflection from Sean, who was not able to make it on the call tonight. Sean Estelle, they, them, pronouns from the Chicago chapter. This was their reflection. And it says, my reflection, which I knew as separate parts, but was crystallized into a synthesized whole, was that in order to be able to have a serious strategic dialogue, debate, and action on a transition to global eco-socialism, countries like Venezuela must be provided the resources and technology to be able to transition rather than be coerced into a carbon-free world. That still has the same imperial relationships of domination. Not an easy conversation to have, but an impossible one to begin when the corporations that have the parts to make a transition to renewables on the grid, even possible, refuse to engage with the state because of trading restrictions set up by the US. The trip as a whole was an incredibly humbling experience, and thanks to my comrades for talking about everything we experienced. So I know that there are folks in the chat that are a little bit, there's a lot of stuff happening in the chat. We had over 40 questions in our question and answer box. I'm sorry if we did not get to your question. We will be, we are going to have a write-up. So as soon as the write-up is released, please feel free to read it, a written report back. Thank you all so much. Again, over 40 questions. So sorry we couldn't get to all of those. It, you know, just the way that it happened. So thank you all, everybody. And really, really, really appreciate everyone taking the time and spending their Sunday evening with us. Please don't forget to sign up for our international committee by July 31st if you would like to get in for the next round. And look us up. We have so many things in the works. We're excited about the next year. And thanks so much, everyone. Have a good night.